idea is that this is less of a presentation and more of a discussion. And the reason why is because a lot of times we talk about these concepts and we get in front and we do a presentation and people don't get some of their questions answered, or they want to do a bit of a deeper dive into an area. And we don't know that unless you tell us. So I'm hoping that this is a discussion. And you have material in front of you, and this is more of an outline for us and starting points, okay? My goal here isn't to get through the whole thing. If we do, that's great. If we don't, that's okay. If we go offline a bit, that's a good thing. So that's the first thing. Another logistics topic is that as soon as this is done, we have to move out right away. And we'll be in the hall so we can answer questions that you have. But they have to rearrange the tables for the next session. So we can't linger as much as we'd like to. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dawn Ward. I am an attorney at Warner Norcross. I have been working in information governance and records retention for over 10 years, probably close to 15. And I am co-chair of our data solutions group. I met Bruce, who will also introduce himself, but I met him a few years ago. I was working on a proof of concept using predictive coding to delete data, to delete rot, so redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. I was working on this proof of concept for a $42 billion company. They wanted to do it, and Warner could do it, but we were missing a piece. We were missing a vendor with respect to how to use the predictive coding model. And we basically looked everywhere, all over the United States. We interviewed several vendors. We wanted somebody that not only had an understanding of predictive coding, but knew how to apply predictive coding to data management, not just e-discovery, that they understood our language. And that's how we found Bruce. So he was our guy. So with that, Bruce, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Bruce Fine with Dagger Analytics. I'm a prior litigator. I am a lawyer. I started my career litigating and saw how the document review process worked and how it was very inefficient to have JDs looking at all of these endless documents, which were the correct classifications of which were very obvious. Thought that maybe a computer could replace a lot of that work. I had a friend from high school who was working in the intelligence community, helping to plow through intelligence haystacks to find the needles. We thought it would be a good fit. Indeed it was, and here I am.
That's right. One other person that I would like to introduce to you as well is Emma McGoodwin. We ended up doing a proof of concept at Warner Norcross on our own documents because we wanted to see how it worked for us, and I didn't want to talk about a client in particular. And Emma was the chosen one for this in her area. She is our librarian. Our proof of concept applied to library records, but it also worked out because Emma is also on our records management team. So it was a perfect fit. So let's talk a little bit about just an overview of what we intend to talk about today. We're going to talk about the problem. So what's the problem? The problem is we have a lot of data and we can't possibly have users go through all of it. We have to use technology. And how do we use it efficiently, cost effectively, and make sure that it's done correctly? So that's the problem. The solution is what we're going to talk about today. We're also going to go through best practices. What do you need to get started? can't just jump right into this. You need a couple of elements in place. We'll go over what predictive coding is, how it works with respect to data management. We'll talk about the proof of concept that we did in-house, and then extrapolate some of those ideas as to how you can use it on a broader scale. So Bruce is going to talk a bit about the problem, the amount of data that we have.
Sure, and I'll just piggyback on what Dawn said. Since it is a conversation, we intentionally sat across from one another. So if a question occurs to you in the course of the discussion, please don't feel like you should wait until the end. We're happy to take this in whatever direction suits you. But I think since our audience is mainly records management people, you have a good sense of the magnitude of the problem. I've seen statistics bandied about like more than 31 gigabytes per user. I think that's low based on my experience, but that translates into hundreds of thousands of Word documents, emails, spreadsheets per user. You've heard of Moore's Law. In this case, the data explosion is Moore's headache because the amount of data is doubling every 18 months. So even though storage capacity is doubling 18 months, it's barely treading water to keep pace. We're not going to innovate our way out of the problem, unfortunately. And then perhaps most significantly is the cost. The cost of enterprise storage can be anywhere from, on the extremely low end, I think I've heard $2 or $5 per gigabyte per year, up to $50 per gigabyte per year. That's for data that you're actively managing and people are accessing. That's quite significant. And if that's all filled up with emails about softball games, then you're wasting a lot of money. And our goal is to help identify the things that you don't need to keep around because it's a lot.
And I think just to add on to that piece is it's a lot of data, and when databases were developed originally, it was to store data. Nobody was thinking about purging data. So you have data repositories that are growing, and they have quite a bit of information in them, but there's no easy fix. The data repository itself doesn't have a purge mechanism, so it's really hard, or at least it appears to be hard, in terms of, okay, well, what do we do? How do we actually take our schedule and our policy and apply it to what we have? So the next slide, or the next topic, is what I call best practices, but really it's where do we start? What do we have to have in place before we can even begin the conversation of using predictive data or predictive coding and the model to get rid of data? You need a policy in place. You need an updated and defensible policy. And the reason I say that is because you have to have authority before you start deleting anything. And you also have to have common language, meaning you all agree, or the company agrees, what a record is, what a non-record is. These are typical terms, but without a policy, you're floating aimlessly. You also need an updated and accurate record retention schedule. And now that you're going to delete information, it's even more important that the retention periods are correct. And of course that they're based on legal requirements, legal considerations. So you want to keep your records long enough to defend the company or bring an action on behalf of the company, and based on legal need as well. And so again, what's the problem? The problem is, okay, we have this policy and we have this schedule, and we may have been applying it decently well to our hard copy records. But really where the problem is with our electronic records. And so, again, I stress that you have to have a place to start, and that's the overarching policy and record retention schedule.
I think Dawn's right, but where we come in is once you have this magnificent records retention schedule in place and you say, here are the documents that we have to keep for X years, well then after X years have passed, how do you find those documents and delete them? A lot of times it's hard to find them, and that's where technology can help, where predictive analytics can help. I'll give a very high-level overview of the way that predictive analytics works. Basically, you have a classifier, and you feed it examples. You feed it documents that are records and documents that are not records. If you have multiple record types, the software can discriminate between record types. So these are audit trail documents. These are not audit trail documents. The classifier then breaks down the documents and discerns what are the indicia of a record, what are the indicia of non-records, and it can predict on the documents where you haven't told it what's a record or not, the probability that those documents are records. And then once the software has done that, you take a sample of its outputs to see does the program know what it's talking about? Is it doing a good job or not of discriminating between records and non-records and different record types? And eventually, the software is doing a good job, and you can decide at that point to go ahead and trust the software's recommendations on what is and is not a record and what can be deleted. One of the nice things about predictive analytics is that you can trade off accuracy for cost savings. So if you want to have 99.99% accuracy, that I'm going to keep 99.99% of my records and only lose 1/1000% of my records. You can do that, but then you'll end up keeping a lot more dreck. Also, if you say I'm satisfied with keeping 95% of my records, identifying them correctly, and that will enable me to eliminate 6 times as many non-records from my system, you can calculate how many non-records do I have, and it's a business decision at that point. What level of accuracy you want in terms of retention, as opposed to how many documents you're going to keep paying that $5 to $50 million a petabyte per year for. So if you'll turn the page to the diagram with the green and red rectangles, that just illustrates what's going on. That reflects your data repository, and the green rectangles with the R's represent records that you want to keep, and the reds represent non-records that you would gladly discard if you were able to. And the way it basically works is that you feed the computer 2 sets of documents. Number one, you feed it some known examples of of records and non-records. One of the nice things about predictive analytics in the IG context as opposed to the e-discovery context is that examples of what you want to keep are usually abundant. If you want to hold on to your sales report, you probably have 6 million of those sales reports that you can feed to the classifier. So that's great. It is going to have a really good idea of what sales reports look like, but maybe you don't know where all of the sales reports are. But once you've provided all these examples to the classifier, it will know, so to speak, what a sales report looks like, and it will know one when it sees one, and it can go and find them. And an ancillary benefit of that exercise is that you'll, in addition to turning up a lot of chaff that you want to throw away, it may also discover wheat in corners of your field that you didn't know it was growing. Not to carry the agricultural analogy too far. The other thing that it's a good idea to feed the classifier, if you can, is a random set of documents. So we will take a look at all the documents on your system, and we'll select a random set of about 5,000 is a good target number usually. You can certainly work with fewer, more is better. But that random set will tell us a couple of things. For one thing, it will provide us with a control set. The only way really to know how a classifier is doing is by random sampling. So you feed it a random sample of documents that gives it some good random training data, and also it provides you with a test set so that you can see of all the documents that my classifier is going to encounter that are out there, how is it going to do on all of those documents, not just on this very non-random select targeted set of training data that I identified by search terms or what have you. It tags for both. So the fundamental output that you'll get is a list of records that you should retain and a list of non-records. And by list, I mean the actual file location, so that your IT department could take that list, and once it's been blessed off on that this list is accurate, and we can delete these documents, either our software can do it, or probably a better idea is for your IT department to take that list and go through and actually delete the documents. But it will.
So trying to process and make sure I'm thinking about this correctly. Is what you're describing more use kind of a two-step approach of the cleanup end as opposed to tagging the documents originally for retention purposes? Because if you on the front end, when the user is saving a document, you tag it to the retention period of whatever the retention type is, then that system takes over, right? But until you have that, is this tool to kind of clean up the data until you can get to that best practice?
That is one of the two basic outputs of the tool. So the tool will identify this document is a record. It will give you a list. Let's say you have 100 record types. We'll say these are all of record type 1s. These are all of record type 2s. These are all of record type 3s. So it will tell you these are your records, and you must hold on to these. Do not delete these. It will also tell you. It will also tell you what is not.
But would you have to run the tool again in another year to identify additional?
Yes, and that's a great. We were talking about that earlier, right?
Yes, that's something called persistent analysis, and it is a great idea. It makes the most sense to once you've done this and run the system once. It makes sense to have the system continue to monitor documents as they're created and to tag them as they get created.
Yes.
Dawn, do you want to speak a little more to that?
Yeah. Oh.
I guess my question is, how does it tag it? Is it tagging the system where it is in your environment? So if it's in SharePoint, it's tagging it there, or is it tagging it on your spreadsheet and you have to make that connection? Does it stay there where you can see it if you pulled up the record?
Sure. Well, as you can imagine, it's not software that you would buy off the shelf at CompUSA. So we can customize it according to your record system, whatever is the best way for you. If you have a back-end database where you do your legal holds and identify what's a record, that would be fine. We can tag in SharePoint we can just give you a list, whatever
Yeah,
works best for you. That's
we
it.
talked about that too, where and that was my question too earlier. And as we went through these proof of concepts that we worked on, is okay. How deep do we get in the proof of concept? First, I wanted to just know what was a record and what wasn't a record. That was my first step, because there's so many non-records, and then I felt like I was making a difference. And then we have our records, right? And then we can classify those. And I didn't want to have it a one-time deal, because that's nice, but it doesn't help me going forward. And so what we can do is then have the system learn as it goes, right? And identify as a record is made, that it's a record, identify something as a non-record as the system is growing in data. And we talked about how, okay, what might be the best way to continue the process. And some folks have purge reports and things like that. And we talked about perhaps once a month, your SMEs get a report and say, these are what have been identified as records, these have been identified as non-records. Somehow they're involved in that. And what you don't want is your SME spending hours and hours and hours doing this. But at the same time, you do want their feedback. They're the ones that know. And so you had explained it a little bit, and maybe you can explain that, how perhaps a system where they can see what's been identified as a record and what's been identified as a non-record.
Sure. So as you set up
or types.
As you set up, what I think your question was getting at is something that we refer to as persistent analysis, where it's not just a one-time clean out the closet, but our system resides on your infrastructure and crawls and analyzes documents as they are created. And so what we would do is sample the documents, because record types change over time. Maybe sales reports from last year to this year, maybe there are 3 new lines this year that weren't in the reports last year, and we need to update our system with the new types of sales reports to make sure that it knows these are sales reports as well. So one thing you could do is at regular intervals, weekly, monthly, could be as infrequent as annually, but probably monthly, is we would present your subject matter expert with maybe 20 documents that had been marked as records or non-records. It would be very easy, just click on a link in an email to go to an intranet site and just say, yep, that's a sales record. No, this is clearly not a sales record. And go through the documents, and then that would provide additional training data to our system to make sure that we were continuing to analyze the records accurately. And that would also enable our system to proactively apply the records classifications to records as they are created, as opposed to following behind with the broom, so to speak.
And I think important in that, what he's just said as well, is that's where your, and I'm going to skip a slide, but that's where your team is really important, because that team understands and has a concept of that and what you're wanting out of this process or this system. And then what you do is you create a process, a written process that says, this is what we're going to do once a month. This is what we're going to do every 6 months. This is what we're going to do yearly, so that it's not ad hoc. They get used to it. It becomes natural. It becomes faster and regular for people to implement. And so that takes me, I want to get into this proof of concept and the idea that I think it's important. My recommendation is that you don't just jump in with a project to start deleting things based on predictive coding. You develop a proof of concept. It's easier to sell to upper management. You figure out the nuances of your systems and how predictive coding works with your systems. You get bugs out to a certain extent, and you I think one of the key features is you develop your ROI, meaning what did it take to get us to this point? And now that we're at the point where we know at least records from non-records, what are our potential cost savings? And when you know what your cost savings are, you can then go to management and say, this is the money we need for resources, and this is your return on it. And that's a lot better sale. It just gives them the ability to make a decision on it versus just saying, hey, we think this sounds nice. The POC that we did for this larger company, we did it at a nominal amount because we felt that it was necessary to just see how it worked. Some of the parts we did for free because we wanted to see how it worked, because it wasn't, we wanted to go through the process before we started to make any big changes and make any deletions. I would also say that once you decide to do a POC, where do you need to start? Well, you need a cross-functional team, and that team is, of course, legal. They give you authority to do it to a certain extent. You need IT. They're going to be the ones doing some of the heavy groundwork. And then records management. They understand the records. They understand that process. And then what you do, and I would say start small. Do not eat the elephant all at once. It's too hard. Everybody gets frustrated. It's not fun. Take a piece of it. Most of your schedules, I'm guessing, are set up by department or by function. Pick one. You could pick a part of one. Don't try to do more than that to start with. It's, again, we found that was too difficult to do. So you pick your function. You also want a function that has a pretty accurate schedule, one where their subject matter experts have signed off on it fairly recently, because they're the ones that you don't want to go back and argue over whether something's a record or a non-record. You want to know in the beginning. And I would also say this: you need an accurate record retention schedule, because what you're going to be doing is asking your subject matter expert. Let's say there's a list of records here. Let's just say it's finance. To get examples, maybe 500 examples. Okay, that's a lot. Of each of those records. This is taking some time from your SMEs. It is. Maybe it's not that many examples, and that can be decided. But what you don't want is an inaccurate schedule, because then what happens is you have a record there that doesn't exist, okay, potentially, and you have your SMEs spinning their wheels trying to find something that doesn't exist. That's frustrating. It's time consuming. The other problem is that you will have, you may have records that aren't listed on the schedule, but they're records. And so the model isn't getting the information that it needs. So you're getting an inaccurate result, or if you're actually deleting, you're deleting records. So I know that folks often want to get their schedules off the internet, or they want to use somebody else's, or they want to call me and say, can't you just give me a list? I can, and it'll be decent. You can get some stuff done with that, but really you need to tailor it. You need to have the right records, and then your SMEs actually feel comfortable with this process. You want them to be on board. So once you pick the function, you get the right SMEs on board. You have your IT, you have your legal, you have your RIM. What database do you choose? Many of our companies that we work with have thousands of databases. Even within a function, they could have many, many, many databases. I would say pick one with the highest rate of return. Okay, the best sell. So maybe one that is large in size, maybe one that has a large growth rate, one that you have a sense from your SMEs that there are a lot of non-records in there, because then that's what you can delete, and that's where your cost savings are. And if there are records in there, they are potentially non-critical records, and they are not unique, meaning this is not the only place you can find them. Oftentimes, a record is in various databases, and your SMEs, they know this. So the one that we did earlier is we picked finance, but we picked a shared drive for them. A shared drive where people were putting things on it all the time. People put whatever they wanted on it. Some of it could be records. Some of it wasn't records. Most of it wasn't records. And it could be anything on their list, anything within their schedule. So they needed to get documents and exemplars from each of those groups. And that was, it was a tug and a push and a how do we do this? And we thought, well, do we want to do a POC where we distinguish this record from this record from this record from this record? And what we decided was, you know what, that's lovely and that's awesome. And in a perfect world, that's great. But let's at least just find out what's a record and not a record and go from there. And then determine what we can get rid of. And so I talk a little bit about non-records. So let's say we have our groups. We have our non-records and we have our records, and we're there. To a certain extent, we're there. At least we think so in terms of accuracy level, okay? Then you have your non-records. You can't go in and just press a button and say, okay, all non-records, delete. I don't mean you can't do it from a technology point. You can. The problem is that want to talk about what kind of non-records are in there. Okay, some non-records do have some value. Even short-term value. It might be a scheduling or a calendar event. It might be a work in progress. But there's some value. And what we decided to do is say, okay, based on what we're looking at and the type of non-records in this system, we're going to look at the last access date. Because if it's a non-record, presumably, and it hasn't been accessed in 3 years, we probably don't want it. But we had to make that decision, and we had to determine what that criteria was. There's also that chance, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is that yeah, you have your records and your non-records, but technology isn't perfect. So there are probably going to be some records in your non-records. What are those? That also kind of helps you decide on that criteria for how we're going to determine what to delete. And then you have your records. Okay, so we have this long list of records. And what we decided, at least with the POC, because we don't, again, you can only dive so deep in the beginning, is to maybe take the longest retention period and say, okay, here's the longest retention period for all these records, and then anything older than this, the longest retention, that could potentially be deleted. And so with that, we were able to kind of figure out what our deletion group was. And so again, to get started, you need your function, you need your database, you need a vendor that understands how predictive coding works, not just in eDiscovery. There's lots of them that know how to apply it to eDiscovery. You need them to understand how to apply it to data management. It's a different approach. And then you need folks to review the documents. And my suggestion is not to have your SMEs do that. They've already spent time. They've already given you what they can give you. Have a document review team, somebody that's cost effective and efficient that can go through it. And the reason they need to go through it, they're not going through all of them, they're going through samples. You have to decide how big those samples are, right? But then they can tell you the accuracy of the model. Because if the model says, yeah, we found 10,000 documents that we're calling records, and they go back and they look and they say, well, that's not really what we're finding. We're finding maybe a 75% rate of accuracy. Maybe you want to go back and get more examples into the system and do some iterations. and hone in on a better number, and that's where you're deciding what is that number. So maybe you can talk about that too a bit, like determining that accuracy rate, because that was a big one for me.
Can I ask
Yeah.
another question regarding legal holds? If the company is relying on custodians to hold records and collect at a later date, how do you handle legal holds in this process?
I would choose a database, and I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I would choose a database that is not have any legal holds related to it. Do you have any of those? I mean, that's
And
a bad
How
question.
would you determine that, right? So do you apply keywords to things? I mean, it sounds like this, it sounds like you would need to have a confidence that legal hold documents
Yes.
are included in the location to be able to execute.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and that's where legal is huge. And when I say legal is involved, the best person to have involved is somebody that knows e-discovery. Because what this also does is as you're looking at this database and looking at this documents, you're learning more about what your company's keeping and where it is. It's a good learning process for you as well. And it's nice to, again, for it to be a POC versus an actual project, because those are things that are going to come up, and then you can talk about those risks and talk about how do we address that, and is it an issue, isn't it an issue, and how do we want to deal with that going forward.
Cindy, I think if you, assuming that your repository offers a way to identify the custodian of a document, which usually it does in some way, then you could get around the legal, you'd have a list of everyone who was subject to a legal hold and just exclude them from the process.
Mm-hmm.
And that's there's almost always a legal hold of some sort or another going on, and you just make an exception to them. You might also want to make non-legal related exceptions. Like you might want to say the CEO's documents are out of bounds. We're not deleting anything
Right.
from the CEO at all, or other key custodians for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. So basically tailoring it as your team sees fit as you go through it, in development of the proof of concept.
So Dawn asked me to talk a little bit about the different types of accuracy that we're looking at, and this is it's a pretty detailed, involved discussion, but one that right now I'd like just to make it clear to you. It's something that you have to think about really hard, because there are different types of accuracy. Let me give an example. If you achieved 99% accuracy on categorizing records and non-records, who here thinks that would be pretty good?
Right.
That sounds really good, right? We're 99% accurate. Well, now let me pose this situation to you. 1% of your documents are records, and your records retention company says you have no records. We're going to delete every file in your entire company. You would have achieved 99% accuracy, because 99% of what you deleted was, in fact, a non-record. So well done. And look at all the disk space we saved also. So you have to think about different types of errors that you can make. Statisticians call them type 1 and type 2 errors. I'll call them errors of omission and errors of inclusion. Another way to think about it is false positives and false negatives. So if you're talking about identifying a record, why don't you everyone turn to the page with this chart on it. This is taken from the proof of concept. So if you look at the number 337, where our model said the document was a record, and it was, in fact, a record. That box gets a check mark. That's great. The model was correct in that box. Now let's go down to the number below, 1,295. those were documents that were not in fact records, but the model said it was a record. So those are errors. Those are false positive errors. We identify documents as records, but actually they weren't records. Well, that's not good that we made that kind of error, but it's also not tragic that you have some emails about softball games included still on your disk space, as long as you're getting rid of a lot of them and you're not getting rid of too many of the records. That's okay. So that's a type of error that you can live with. Now go to the upper right corner, the red number 33. That number's in red because these are the really bad types of errors. These are documents that were records, and the model said that they were not records. That's the type of error that you really need to look out for. Mm-hmm. And what you can do, as I said before, is you can trade off that type of error with the other type of error. So you can reduce the number of false negatives that you have, but the trade-off for that is you're going to get more false positives. And so it may be that to reduce the number of false negatives from 10% to 5% means that you'll have twice as many false positives in your data set. Well, if you're still deleting 90% of your false positives, that's probably a trade-off that you want to make. It's probably worth it because you're paying marginally more in annual storage costs, but you're still deleting the great bulk of your non-records, and you're hanging on to an additional 5% of your records, which could be quite significant. But if you're already at, let's say, 98, you're retaining 98% of your records, and to boost that up to 99% would mean that you're going from deleting 90% of your non-records to only deleting 50% of your non-record. That trade-off might not be worth it. If you're in a large company where you're paying multiple millions of dollars a year for enterprise storage, you could be foregoing several $1 million a year in storage savings just to keep that additional 1% of records. So, as I said at the outset, the nice thing about this is you can make it into a business decision, weighing the expected cost of deleting 1% of your non-records against the amount of money that you anticipate saving by deleting. If you'll indulge me with just one more agricultural analogy, imagine that you have got a hay field full of hay, and there are needles throughout the haystacks in your field. In the course of tearing through that haystack to get to the needles, some needles are going to go out with the hay. But if you can keep the number of needles small enough and you can get rid of enough hay, it's still a very worthwhile transaction. It's a cost-benefit analysis. Another thing to consider is you're not comparing losing some records and deleting a lot of non-records to a platonic ideal in which you have all of the records and none of the non-records. That's not achievable. What's the alternative? The alternative is you've probably got your needles, your records, stowed in different places, and you don't even know where they are. So while, yes, you have them in that they exist on your disk system, you don't even know where they are, and if you had to find them, you couldn't, at least not without going through an exercise very similar to this one. So if anything, it may help you, it may render a greater percentage of your records practicably useful and revive them into usefulness where before they were moribund because they were buried and interwoven with so much extraneous matter.
And I think one thing too, I mean, we talk about, this is a little bit of an aside, but we talk about cost, and we talk about what average cost is for storage. And I think one thing as you go through the proof of concept is to talk and focus on a little bit, as you determine the rate of return, is to sit down with IT and say, okay, this is how much data is in this database. Your IT folks may not know right off. In fact, in the POC we did, part of what Bruce's team was going to do is tell us how many gigabytes, petabytes we were dealing with. And then there's also the discussion of, well, how much is it costing the company? You'd be surprised. Some companies are good at this, others don't do it as much, where the IT folks sit down and actually analyze the cost of that storage. But that's a really important exercise. It's an exercise that we don't often ask our IT to do because they're just busy trying to make the system work. And oftentimes what they want to do is add on because the folks they're working for are asking them to. And but it is a cost. It's a cost for them. And so part of it, again, with that ROI part of section is, all right, let's talk about accuracy. Let's talk about, but we also are talking about a business cost analysis, right? A risk benefit analysis. What's our benefit? We need to know our benefit. Our benefit is really dependent on our better understanding of what IT can tell us in terms of the amount and the cost. Then we can throw in some more soft numbers, right? What if we had to produce this? What does that look like? How much would that cost us to have to produce non-records? And that's a harder sell because it's not a solid number necessarily, but it is a number, and it is a cost, it is a risk. So again, part of the team, IT, being involved. And I don't know if you mind us taking you just a tad into just the proof of concept we did at Warner, just so you know what we did. And I wanted to do something in-house. I didn't want to touch my client files. Even though it was a POC, I knew everybody would throw up their hands and go, oh my goodness gracious. So I chose an admin function. And I chose library services because honestly I felt like it was the least contentious to choose. And Emma just happened to understand records management and could help me. And so it was a matter of, okay, where are our library documents? And how do we get them to Bruce? We ended up using an extranet site to do that, wherein we identified the exemplars that were records and the exemplars that are non-records. It's not like eDiscovery, you just hand something over at first into a system. And I wanted to ask Bruce to talk a little bit about the various ways that he gets to the data, because that's not the only way. You have so much data, you're not going to put it all on an extranet site. It just happened that we had, a reasonable amount of data to do that. It worked for us. So maybe you can address that.
Sure. Well, in a typical eDiscovery case, you talk to your client's IT department, and they'll identify the custodians who could have relevant documents, and then they pretty much just copy it and give it to you, or image some hard drives or something. But when you're talking about terabytes up to petabytes of data, that's not practical. So what we would do is set up a system behind your firewall and crawl through your actual directories and data repositories.
Yes.
It would be too expensive and nonsensical to try to send us 7 petabytes of of data. And as Dawn was saying, you don't want to try to swallow too much at one time. Start with a proof of concept in one discrete area with a more manageable amount of data. And even then, what we would do is we wouldn't try to download 1 billion documents or analyze 1 billion documents. We would take a random sampling of, say, 100,000 documents from those data repositories and build a model and do our random sampling on maybe 5,000 out of those 100,000 documents that we analyzed.
Right. So what we did that, we got some good results back. I think our accuracy at the beginning was quite high, if I recall, 95% maybe?
Yes.
Don't recall. And then we said, okay, Bruce, we want to see a bit of a different model. Can you throw in a bunch of documents? Non-library documents, non-records, and see how the model works. And that's the results, I believe, that you're showing here.
Right. So I actually had prepared a spreadsheet, not being aware that we wouldn't have access to a projector, but I've got some of the results here in the table. So what the one way that the library POC differed from the real world is that they gave us about 1,500 documents, 500 records, and 1,000 non-records. Typically, the percentage of records would be a lot lower than that. It's kind of cheating. It's easier when a large proportion of your documents are records. It's easier for the model for reasons that I won't go into. So what we did was we took 25,000 non-records taken from a publicly available data set and threw them into the mix as well. And to take just one arbitrary trade-off, I said, let's identify 90% of the records and see what percentage of the much more voluminous non-records we could get. So now we're dealing with 2% of our data is records, 98% is non-records. If you were to preserve 90% of those records, that would enable you to delete more than 95% of the non-records. So you're deleting 95% of 98% of the data. So it adds up to just about exactly 95% of the data you would be able to delete. And if you extrapolate that to terabytes and petabytes, that could be quite significant.
What kind of numbers would that be in savings? Just using general numbers.
Sure. Well, if you take a look at the graph below, and then I think we may be about out of time. But if you take a look at this graph, on the x-axis is the number of defensibly deletable terabytes that you find, and on the y-axis is the number of millions of dollars per year. Sorry, this is per 3-year period that you would save in storage costs based on an estimate of $15 per petabyte. Sorry, $15 per gigabyte per year in enterprise storage cost, which is towards the lower end of what we've seen. So if you were to find, for example, 500 terabytes of data, and if your data was along the same lines as the library POC we've been discussing, where 98% were non-records, 2% were records, then you could save a few tens of millions of dollars per 3-year period in annual storage.
So, savings, people. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.